And I think we will get started. So hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Tom-Fordhauser, again, from the Center for Justice Innovation. And you are with us in a workshop called The Role of Abusive Partner Intervention Programs in a Coordinated Community Response. We will start by having our amazing faculty introduce themselves. And so we'll just go across the line. We'll start with you, David. If you want to introduce yourself and maybe to just ground us in this space, if you want to tell us one word that comes to mind when you hear the words or the phrase coordinated community response.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for picking us. My name is David Garvin. I am the Director of Battering Intervention Services and Systems Response with the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I'm also the chair of the Battering Intervention Services Coalition of Michigan. And the word that comes to mind when I think of coordinated community response is potential.
Awesome. How about you, Greta?
Hi, everyone. My name is Gretta Gardner. I am co-founder and chief legal officer for Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. I started in this work as a prosecutor in Baltimore City back in the 90s, right after the first VAWA was passed. And gosh, I'm trying to think, what does coordinated community response mean to me? It means solutions.
Oh, I like that. Awesome. How about you, Jeremy?
Let me unmute myself here.
Yeah.
Jeremy Nevilles-Sorrell. I am co-director of Wica, Agli, and that means to return a man. And that's the program that I work with based out of South Dakota. I'm Anishinaabe, Winnebago. The program is Lakota-based program. And so that's a Lakota word for that. And that's part of our work of working with men, doing batteries intervention services, doing across the country, technical assistance, and of course, all the fun things like we're here for, coordination, public policy stuff, all the good things. So when I think of coordinated community response, I jokingly wanted to say work because it's the first thing that popped in my head. And when I really think about it, I'm not going to focus on the heavy side of doing the intervention work. I'm going to focus on the active side, because that's one of the things we see nowadays over the years is people don't want to leave their office anymore. So let's get people out and about and do some work. They want to send meetings, they want to post online and think they're coordinating something. Let's get out there and do some work.
Awesome. I love that. Thanks. So today we have three objectives. We are going to hopefully help define a coordinated community response and have a healthy discussion about what it is and maybe what a coordinated community response 2.0 could look like and how we can bring the community into the coordinated community response. We'll talk about the roles of abusive partner intervention programs in that CCR. And then we'll really talk about what those partnerships can look like, what relationship building can look like in the context of a CCR. We began the day talking about our guiding principles, and I'm just having them here for you again. And as we move through this discussion, talking about a CCR, we'll be talking about how these guiding principles come into play in the context of a CCR as well. But we want to learn a little bit more about you. And so we have two poll questions. So the first one is, do you have a CCR in your community? And in a minute, the poll is going to pop up and you can say yes, no, or don't know. So Mary Kate, awesome. All right, this is good. This is good. It's interesting that there's a lot of I don't knows in here. And we can talk about that. Okay, great. So we've got almost half saying yes, and we have some saying they don't know or no. And so I don't know if any of our faculty have any tips about finding out whether you have a CCR, but I think that is part of what this siloing, and I know David and Jeremy, you'll be talking about that, how we don't know who's coordinating and collaborating with one another and how that can really hinder our work and our ability to see things, as you were talking about earlier today, Greta, intersectionally. If we're showing up at that intersection and we don't look around and see what else is happening and who's coordinating with whom, we can miss that opportunity.
Yeah, I think just for people out there who are providing services who may not be on this other end, I think starting with the courts and finding out, is anyone doing any of this type of work? Maybe court clerks, maybe domestic or in your protection order courts, those areas where you will see a lot of people observing and having access. So the civil court side and the court clerk's probably the way to start.
So can I say something? My name is Raquel Lloyd, and I work at the jail in Auburn, where we have a re-entry team. And the first Thursday of every month, we have what's called like a community meeting. So we have DSS come out, we have parole, we have all the providers, substance abuse and mental health. And that, right, it's one Thursday a month. Not everybody comes, but we try, because I host the meeting, so we definitely try to have that. So we could basically have a community linkage where we understand like what's going on and how we're able to provide resources to the community and help our clients together, or without like double dabbing on the resources that we provide for them. Like being able to work with each other to have a complete transition back into society.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we invite anyone else to share their experiences into the chat. I know, David, you came off mute, and then we'll move into our next poll. Do you have any thoughts or responses?
I think there's a couple reasons that people may not know. One could be that it exists, but it's not coordinated. That is often the case, that there's a meeting, everybody comes together once a month, signs in, everybody kind of introduces themselves, and not a lot gets done. So I think that's one answer. And the other, I think, has to do with the historical place or space for APIPs or BIPs, or depending on where you are, if it's pop or soda, the place for us at the table. And sometimes to a certain extent, people may not know the history of why BIPs or APIPs may not be a welcome participant. So it could be kind of on the outside. The BIP APIP is on the outside and it's going on, but you just don't know about it due to historical trust issues. And we can get into some of that today, but I think it's a deep well.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, so let's talk about, if you do have a CCR in your community, are you a member of it? We'd love to hear from those of you who have one. So let's see if we can start up that poll. Yeah, and go ahead, David, folks, or Greta, anything you want to add?
I don't know if the results of that last poll got shared.
Oh, okay. We'll do that. We'll make sure we do that. Great. So here's the second poll here. And those of you who have a CCR in your community, it looks like it's split almost 50-50 here as to whether you're a member of it. So any of our faculty want to comment on that?
Just roughly the numbers off the bat match the I don't know and no percentage of 46, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
I think if you have one and you're not a member, we're going to be talking about what that participation can look like. And I think Jeremy's going to talk to us a little bit about the beginnings of a CCR and maybe how a CCR can evolve over time. And David's going to be talking about membership in New Mexico, and Greta's going to be giving us some context about ways to expand those partnerships and deepen those. Okay, great. So we'd love to hear from you in the chat as we move through. One of the reasons to start a CCR is because intimate partner violence is impacting our communities, and we need to come together as a community and think about ways to support survivors and their children, and also those who are causing harm through IPV. I think someone, and I'm not sure if it was you, Greta, I think it was in the previous panel, really talking about the communities being a place of healing and wellness. And I think a CCR can be that place where we are all coming together to create that community. So we invite you to put in the chat some ways in which IPV is impacting your community. Again, many of you are familiar with the power and control wheel from our friends in Duluth. And I think here we can see the various ways, and it resonates with some of the responses in the chat, where looking at the ways IPV and the harms of IPV impact survivors and children, these also play out in our communities. Folks who are feeling isolated are not going to be able to engage in the community in the ways that we would like. We want to have a community where all people are thriving. Using children, that we know that our school systems and others, they're the ones working with those children who are impacted by IPV. So again, thinking about the power and control wheel really resonates with why we need a robust CCR in our community. Greta, I want to turn it over to you. I know you use this slide often to talk about many ways in which survivors are engaged in systems.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so if you can imagine just one phone call, or even if you didn't even call, if a neighbor called or a bystander called or anybody called, or if even a police officer, a law enforcement official was in plain sight witnessing an assault. These are all of the systems that just one person would have to either have to access or could choose to access. But one can, it's almost like a domino effect, right? One can lead into the other. For example, if in the red, that's the criminal legal system, that there's an investigation, there's an arrest, there's not an arrest, you have all these hearings, these meetings to go to. If an officer does the investigation or the arrest in your home, and if there are children present, depending on the circumstances, conditions, and or bias of the law enforcement officer, there could be engagement in the child welfare system if they choose to take your children. Think of the Nevilles-Sorrell case in New York many years ago. Or, you know, when usually you go to a shelter program or advocacy program and they give you the three options, right? What are the three options? You can file criminal charges, you can get a protection order, and or you can go to shelter. Well, if you get a protection order, that's a couple of appearances. That's not just one. You go for your ex parte, then if there's a service, you got to go back for the protection order hearing. If the other person is not served, then you got to get a postponement, and or you can just be summarily denied and you have to start the process all over again. And so when you look at all of these, not to overuse the word intersections, but the way that all of these systems come together and how there are so many ways that it almost works in concert to not have a victim or a survivor participate in any one of these processes, because it is so much. Because remember, she's in crisis, and I'm going to use she for ease of conversation. She's in crisis. She's still got to be a mother if she has children. She still has to work. She still has to pay bills. She still has to do all of the things that we all have to do as functioning adults, and yet show up in every single one of these systems as they are siloed and as they interact. Because if you have an ex parte order going on and you have a criminal case going on, then there needs to be information about, do we need a no contact order or should we have one? Because what if the, you know, I mean, all of these things that require decisions to be made in her best interest that may or may not give her the time, that may not give her the space, that may not give her the resources to make informed decisions that are in the best interests of her family and herself.
Again, when we're thinking about this, and Greta illuminated the reasons why we need to come together, all those system players and community players, really thinking about how we can enhance and center those survivor voices in our processes and in our systems and in our community responses. And then how can we all work together to enhance that accountability that's both personal, and then how do we hold ourselves accountable as a community to both the survivor, the person who's caused harm, and how can we break down some of those barriers that our systems have created for both survivors and the person causing harm. So here's a definition of the coordinated community response that we created through one of our projects with the Office on Violence Against Women there. And you can see really bringing those robust and diverse groups together to respond to those harms that are caused by intimate partner violence. A coordinated community responses are different from some of the targeted collaborations that you might have in your community. Many of your communities may have a fatality review team or a high-risk team or a DART or a DVRT, all the alphabet soup of collaboration. Many of you have family justice centers, and those are really, if you think about a coordinated community response as your garden, each of those things might be the individual plants that you put into your garden, but you need that larger CCR to hold that and create the fertilization and the nurturing of all those individual collaborations. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeremy, and really talk about the history of the coordinated community response as someone who is in the beautiful state of Minnesota.
And the lovely town of Duluth. So yes, everyone, a little bit of the history of the goings on of how this all came about. It's actually interesting that Duluth wasn't the designated city. There was actually 3 cities, Milwaukee, Duluth, and I forget what the other third city was. It just so happened that when Ellen Pence was organizing and trying to find a site to do this type of work, to pilot test this, the only people agreeable to do it were here in Duluth. So it wasn't like Duluth was this hotbed of activity going on. It was like, nope, they just had a situation where they needed some help. And so this was very beneficial for the systems people. And that was always the one thing that carried you. Whatever you do on your organizing, if you're going to ask the system people for something, try to help their work out a little bit, take some of that burden off. And that's how you build some of those underlying relationships there, because then it's a mutual regard for people and having an understanding of their work. So that's interesting about this process. And it was funny that the CCR title was a fancy thing that came up by another international person doing work. And they said, hey, why not give it something flashy? It also became the downside to this model of organizing because people get lost in the whole idea of the community response. And so from the beginning, people never really got the intervention and the policy side down. And I say to people when they go about this, right, the idea of this was to monitor how effective you are with your policies. You say you're going to do X, Y, and Z in your policies, and then what's the next step? And they're going to do X, Y, and Z in their policies. And all you do is line up and evaluate how well you're doing in compliance with your policy. And are you hitting all your marks? Are you missing them? And then if you're missing them, why are you missing them? It's a very simple process, but it got fancy, the CCR title and all that, and it just went crazy awry. So there's a lot of people who have a lot of challenges in implementing, but also at the same time, there are challenges with coordinating amongst people and different views and ideas and all that stuff. So that's that challenge and that struggle and coming together. I heard a story when I first came up here of them organizing the advocates trying to work with law enforcement and train law enforcement. They said they went in there and after 10 minutes of being with the cops, the advocates were saying they were so bad and awful. The advocates climbed out the bathroom window to escape and never went back to the Duluth PD to finish that presentation. So there's a lot of things that happen in order to work through all of that, in order to come to this place. But it was really taking advantage of a need. And that's what people tend to do. Something happens, unfortunately, that tends to be the case, and then people respond, and then they have cause to react. If everything's going fine, there's usually not a lot of issues with getting people to jump up and say, hey, I'm ready to do something with you all. And if you're going to do that route, then it's one of those, it takes a little bit longer to grind through that. But that was the idea, right? To move through and say, how can we improve the way that we're responding in these cases, and how is each person linked to one another? So these primary players were there, the law enforcement response to the courts, to the criminal courts. And then later on, the civil stuff was added. But the idea around that coordination in the beginning was to see how the criminal justice system would respond. But as we start looking at those cases, we actually see that there was a lot more cases going through the civil process. And so how we tend to look at all of those. So when you look at that, this whole model approach, and I tend to like a wheel, a circular diagram versus one of these, because people get a little linear in thought when they see diagrams like this or graphics. But that's just the, that's just the case processing through the system. And the years, I started out in '94 doing supervised visits and exchanges. And at that point, the visitation center wasn't even a key part of that model. But it was one of these key things when you look at that intervention, when you go after 911, law enforcement, prosecution, probation, advocacy, and shelter, then you're getting into supervised visitation. Somewhere around legal aid, abusive partner intervention, all that stuff's coming into play. So we finally inserted ourselves in the response. So a program, the Supervised Visitation Center, was thought up as a reaction to the organizing, to fill a void, but it wasn't planned in the beginning, so it was never part of that CCR team. It's one of those programs that came out and evolved in response to a high level of further assault and homicide in response to domestic violence cases, right? But we didn't think of it as a core piece. And this is where it goes into that talk about how we tend to evolve this model and this approach. And so while ideally we said these are the core people to have a part of it, you want the advocates. Actually, the advocates stayed at the center of the wheel because the advocates also reflected victim safety, putting women at the center of your work. So the victim safety pieces. So that was always key. And then we just basically walk through who comes next. You call the cop, you call 911, so that'll be there. It's 911 dispatch, then the responding officers, and then you go to the courts, investigators, prosecutors, all these other people, right? And then post adjudication, batter's intervention, and that's restorative justice services also came on later on as well. But here's one thing that's key before I pass it back to Rebecca in there, is when we were talking about this, and people say, why is the CCR so different in Duluth than elsewhere? And it wasn't until we're saying about what's that key role of batter's intervention and APIPs in the CCR. Well, up here in Duluth, it's coordinated by the BIP program. And that's very unusual. And I'm thinking back, doing national work since '98, training people on doing this in '98. And it wasn't until we had this conversation that I realized 99% of the programs are advocacy programs who are doing the coordination. So when you look at the advocacy piece, what tended to happen over the years is as more people start coming into this work, they were familiar with case management. So we saw a lot of CCR work go away from public policy to case management. That circle process, wraparound process, all that other stuff is starting to lean over this way to say, how are we getting women out and getting women to do what they need to do versus over here on the accountability side, how do we hold the men accountable? And by talking about how do we hold the men accountable, we're also talking about how do we keep the systems accountable? And that was the big piece. We wanted to make sure that the systems were doing what they said they're going to do. If law enforcement says, and many of you who are on those CCR teams, you got the law enforcement cards that has every step they're supposed to do and every question they ask when filling out a report. And when you come to monitor, you just line up the report with your questions and say, did they ask all 9, 10 questions, right? And that's what the whole idea was, to make sure people were doing it and then figuring out ways of doing it. And if it was successful, what made it successful? And if it was a problem, what made it a problem? But that continued evolution is where we got this core piece, but then we got these other pieces that continue to go on and enhance as we say, how is intimate partner violence intersected with other issues and other players across the board? So you get school systems, hospitals, and so on who are now involved.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jeremy. And I really love how you said you need to have a focus and an intent, maybe a goal or a vision statement for your CCR. And we'll see an example from one of the CCRs that David was a member of. But I think, the focus there being on system accountability. Let's look at our paperwork. Let's look at our protocols. Let's make sure that we are doing what we're saying, holding ourselves accountable in holding that individual accountable. So thanks for that. And I think really you can see here, this is a huge group of people that we are encouraging you to think about how can they play a part in addressing those harms of IPV that you mentioned in your community. How can we bring all these diverse group of stakeholders together to really be a part of the CCR? And that can get unwieldy, right? If you have 70 people in a room. So thinking about, subcommittees and those all those different ways to logistically manage it. But I like how you said it evolved over time based on what the needs of survivors were and how you thought and expanded what it means to hold someone accountable and who else needs to be a part of those discussions and reviews. So thanks for that. So I'll just back it up here. Again, we're going to focus now on the guiding principles of centering culture and community and really centering racial justice in this work and how through our partnerships and through our CRs, we can address those two things. And I'm wondering, Jeremy, in the evolution of the CCRs and your work with Wica Agli, like how has the in different ways, or what's your experience been in really centering those voices of Native women or the needs of the men in the communities in which you live into this kind of CCR approach?
It's been a challenge working in Native communities because of the different level of resources that are there. And that comes from the knowledge base and other services to help, and also the dollars to fund a lot of these programs, which has always been that challenge, right? So how do we get at that CCR moving and organized? And what tends to happen is people get funding, they balloon, and then once the funding shrinks up, they go back to their core programs. So we've always had this expanding out to do more CCR work, and then when things get tight, it's just going back to core services for victims. So it's always been a big one there. And the other layer that's challenging for us in Native communities, it's not like we're individual municipality or a city or whatever it is, or a county. Some people just do countywide stuff. Tribes cover so many areas that it's not just one county or city. We're going to work with 4, 5, 6 plus counties, sometimes cities all together, and our own internal governments. So you think about that layers of this type of work, the layers and layers that move on for helping people organize and respond gets a little bit more complicated for where you're coming from. So this is why it's nice to have some values and principles, so you don't get caught up in the structure of going, I need to replicate this 8 different places. You could start out and do things a little bit different. Say, how are we going to look at these core things, right? How are we going to look at hope and dignity? How are we going to look at survivor voices and maybe culture, right? And then you can work with your people or the people around you in that way. Say, how are we carrying this forward inside of our work? And that's one of the things that's very critical when we talk about that, the survivor voices. That's usually the number one thing we could do. And if we're going out and we're helping make sure that there's some level of prosecution or communication, that's the number one thing. We do projects and we talk with women all the time. The big question women have most is not why didn't he get charges? Why weren't there charges? Why didn't he get convicted? No, how come he was never arrested? Like, those things are key. And those are the areas that you could start out when you hear from people in your community. Then you're not overwhelmed with saying, I'm organized with 27 agencies. I can talk with 4 or 5 different law enforcement departments at a time, and then move through that piece, and then go to the next piece and the next piece, and then bring that stuff back.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremy. And I think I heard you say, it's important to cultivate those different relationships. We can't just do a generic, please come, this is a safe space. We really need to fertilize the soil and make those relationships meaningful so that we can have those hard conversations about how IPV is impacting our community. I think
I'd say, in all honesty, what I've seen across the country, it's mainly advocates, law enforcement, and service providers, maybe the prosecutors a little bit, but your core people responding usually are the service providers in those first levels of immediate intervention. what we like to call the real-time intervention. When everything matches, like in real time, you get a call, the police are there in minutes, then he's arrested, then he's arraigned, he's in court within 48 hours. Then after that, institutional time takes over. Then it's 8 months, 12 months before you see the next step in place. So those people who are responding in that quick time are usually the ones where they have a lot of that.
Yep. Oops. I don't know what just happened there. Let's see. We got slides just went a little bit nutty. But while we're going back to here, I do think that when we're talking about cultivating relationships, we need to think about our CCR as that fertile ground where survivors, often survivors of color, undocumented survivors, survivors with disabilities, survivors from LGBTQAI plus community, and those other survivors from historically underserved communities who choose not to engage in the legal system, that our CCR can still support them in their process of healing. And so that we are creating that safe and thriving community that was talked about in our intersectionality panel. And I think that really involves planning and active cultivation of those relationships and partnerships. If we think about it as a garden, and though Gretta and I just admitted before this that we're horrible gardeners, we know different plants some need more water, some need shade. We really need to be intentional about how we're engaging and authentic in that outreach so that our CCRs can be those places where we're making that change. And so wanted to turn it over to you, Gretta, a little bit to talk about what it means to collaborate and the different types of collaboration that we might see in things.
Sure. Does the video play?
It should. Let's see. Let me see where it is. Okay, and maybe Jess needs to press it because I think she's sharing her screen.
Okay.
No?
No. Okay, that's all right. I can describe it. I think one of the things that we did talk about in the previous session is that one size does not fit all. And that when we talk about a coordinated community response, there are different interpretations, there are different needs, and all jurisdictions are not the same. And so it really behooves us as those who participate in a CCR, what do we mean by coordination? And so for many of you who are old school, maybe Gen X and above, you saw Boomerang, and in this clip, his friend's father is talking about how his whole outfit coordinates. And so the shirt matches the inside of his jacket. He's even got the matching belt and everything matches. And so is that what your CCR does? Does your CCR mean that you have the same philosophical approach across all agencies? Do all of the services match? So that might be okay in some instances, but in other instances, what are you missing? If everything matches and it's not flexible, if it's not nimble, what are you missing? And does that mean coordinated if you're all matching? In the next slide, we see that coordinated could mean being in sync. Are we all just doing the same thing at the same time? And so does that mean that law enforcement works in sync with our services? Do the courts, are they in sync? You know, and you get it, are all the partners in sync? And so does that reference philosophy? Does that reference services? Does that reference responses, resources, and all of those things? Next slide. Or is that all hands on deck? We're all are pulling the same weight at the same time, because that's the only way the job will get done. That's the only way we can provide the services to the people we seek to serve. Does that mean your hand on top of my hand, and then we will pull this together? Next slide. Or does coordination mean more of a relay? I've done my job, and therefore I am handing you the baton and you may go forth. And I think this is more or less how we think about the intervention pieces of our work. So there's a 911 call, police respond, they hand the case over to the prosecution, and or they may give a brochure to the survivor, and then services takes over on that part. Prosecution then brings it to the courthouse and before the court and or the jury, and then those processes happen. The way I like to think about it is a coordinated community response is all of those things, right? And it really depends on what task you are trying to accomplish at any given time. And that CCR should be fungible enough that you can implement any one of these things. But generally, what it means is not chaos, that not everybody is just doing their own thing on their own time in their own way, that there is a coordination of how each ally or community-based organization or system stakeholder is responding to the issue at hand. And we're talking about gender-based violence. And so it's not, well, the police are going to do their own thing because they're not at the table and we'll just catch up with them when we can. And it's not just, well, the local women's shelter or advocacy organization doesn't want to talk to prosecution, and so there's no conversation or relationship building there. It really is everyone coming to the table and figuring out what their roles and their responsibilities are within this CCR and to the community at large. So we talk often about the little C and the big C as far as the community within the CCR and the big C of the community writ large. But I think what's really important to understand, and the thing when I was chair of the CCR in Austin, was everyone came to the table. That was great. You know, I never had to pull teeth to get people to come to the table, but everyone came with their own agenda. And so really, how did we get people to put down their agendas and come up with the CCR's agenda, where the voices of the big C were heard and respected? Next slide. So one of the things that I realized in doing the CCR is that there were some really basic things that really needed to happen for it to be successful. And one was communication. And I think in contemporary times, communication looks like a lot of different things. We have text, we have GroupMe, we have email, we have voicemail, we have all of these modalities. And there's no guarantee that somebody will still get the message. And so I think it's really important because jurisdictions, whether you're rural, you're urban, you're small, you're big, how busy your partner really will depend on what is the best way to communicate, not only with the organizations and agencies at the table, but individuals. One of the first things I asked all of our stakeholders is, what is the best way for me to communicate with you? And some people are like, I never read my email. It's too overwhelming. Can you please send me a text, or can you please call me? I think sometimes we forget that you can actually call people nowadays and talk to them one-on-one. And now we've also got Zoom, right? And so I made up lists of, I know this person will hear me if I do this, or I would just do multiple modalities so that it casts a wide net and something will eventually be captured by someone. The second thing is organization. Like you, in order to be a chair or the convener or the person who keeps this all together, organization is key, particularly when you have subcommittees and working groups, making sure that all of the pieces have what they need, that minutes are taken, that they are distributed, that work groups have what their tasks are, and to keep them on task, to make sure you have a meeting room, making sure the meeting times are static so that people can remember them. If you move times and dates and locations, you're going to lose people. Planning is also very important. We talk a lot about how this movement was born in crisis and we remain in crisis, and planning is not one of our strong suits unless it's safety planning for survivors. But being planful, one of the things that when I came to chair the CCR was, it was called a task force. And I said, in order to be a task force, you have to have a task. And they didn't have a task. And so one of the first things we did was plan out what we wanted to do and to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we did that. The next tier, I think, which is beyond important, it's just crucial, is patience. Systemic change takes time. I think there are probably various articles and research documents about systemic change takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years. I never got anything done or passed once I got the buy-in, the plan, the organization, the commitment. It's in 3 years. We got a lot done, but almost every major project took about 3 years. And when you are impatient, things fall, people drop off, people get defensive, agencies don't want to participate, and you just have to be patient and dedicated, because it is not easy when we're talking about systemic change and dismantling structural barriers for the people we seek to serve. And then the passion.
I was like, Greta, can you give an example of one of those bigger projects that took that longer bit of time? I don't want people to get deterred from, okay, it's going to take forever, because there's some things that are quick fixes and some things that are more evolved, which I'm sure you're talking about.
Sure, I will give you the biggest chip on my shoulder that still exists now, and it's been almost 8 years. So law enforcement came to me and they said, Greta, can we do something about people who have guns that shouldn't have guns? I said, say more. And they said, domestic violence offenders. They still have their guns. They don't know what to do with them. We don't know where to put them. And I said, absolutely, because this was coming from law enforcement. Within the larger CCR, we created a work group of subset of folks. We even invited the defense bar to participate in what a firearms surrender and forfeiture protocol would look like. It took me at least 3 years to create the written protocol, model orders. We had a partner who was the, what do you call the marshals. They did evidence control for the marshals, and they were a bailment, and they were willing to do this for us on a sliding scale for people to surrender their weapons to them, because Austin Police Department said, we don't have the room. Sheriff said, we don't want them. And the constable's like, we just don't have the room. ATF said there's so many guns in Central Texas, we're afraid our floors are going to fall through. So we had to be creative on what community partners could we have take up this charge for us. And I will tell you, after the 3 years of creating this nicely camera ready, had commitment from the bench, we're gonna implement this. And I left Austin in 2016. It has still not been implemented. But they are now our grantee of OVW for the Firearms Technical Assistance Project. And so we, amongst our partners, CJI, are working with them to finally get this across the finished floor. But that was 2013. So what is that, 9 years now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. It's so funny you picked that particular topic, because way back in the 90s, we did 4 years on it and we all gave up.
Yeah. And I think it's because of relationship, and it was so important to law enforcement. And when I left, the CCR really said, we're not going to let this go. We're not going to let this go. And bless their hearts, they haven't.
Yeah.
But they
But
also
that's
go
Isn't
ahead.
that a classic example of now you went into a whole different realm of law enforcement, 3 to 4 different layers around law enforcement. So you got
Yeah.
a whole new coordination among people. This is examples of how it got so big in so many areas over the last 40 years.
Absolutely. And just to add a little razzle dazzle into your CCR, there has to be trust, and you have to break it all down. One of the things that when I realized there was this distrust in the room, I asked everybody to write down their 3 greatest successes for the 14 years that they had the grants to encourage arrests, which is now improving criminal justice responses. And one of the answers was like, many agencies said back in 1975, so-and-so. I was like, okay, we need to just put that aside and rebuild. Humor is important. The work that we do is incredibly hard. Vicarious trauma is real. I think everyone that comes to the table has good intent, and it gets very difficult to do the heavy things all the time. So levity allows people the space to bring their best selves to the table. And of course, food. That is sometimes a culturally welcoming activity, but if you can find other funding to have food in your meetings, especially when you're asking people to give up their lunch breaks in order to participate or after work, it's really important.
I'll take it from here. Thank you, Greta and Jeremy and Rebecca. It's funny you were talking about food. I just flashed back on a memory. We had a focused meeting with stakeholders, primarily law enforcement, and I remember we called it the steak and egg holders meeting because we got a local restaurant to give us a really good deal on catering steak and eggs, and people come to the table if you put out a spread. But that's not the way it always was. I intentionally joined this movement in 1986 and unintentionally back as far as 1974. And in 90, I'm sorry, I said 96, 86. In 1986, the coordinated community response looked like this cartoon here. There was no coordination. There was no relationships to speak of. And in fact, I'll even put myself in there too. I didn't know that a BIP APIP should have a working relationship with the local domestic violence survivor service organization. I remember going to a wonderful 2-day seminar done by the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence under the leadership of Barbara Hart. And it was entirely focused on the importance of BIP APIP having a good working relationship with the survivor service organization. But that's not a CCR. Those are just the building blocks. So when it came to the community that I started practicing in, or did the majority of my practice in, which was Ann Arbor, Michigan, if you ask the judges what they thought about domestic violence in their community, they would say, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem here because I don't really see that many cases in front of me. And if you ask the prosecutors, they would say, we don't really prosecute domestic violence because we don't get very good police reports from the police. And I remember one of the prosecutors bringing a police report to some meeting, and it says went to the home of a domestic on the police report. That was the entirety of the police report. And the prosecutor said, I can't prosecute a case. I can't even tell if anybody was home, let alone whether or not a crime had been committed. And then if you ask, the cops would say, we don't really do much with that because the prosecutors don't really care about prosecuting our cases. So we don't do anything with that. And then the real kicker came with the intense, fervent, negative relationship between the survivor service organization and law enforcement. And I'm going to repeat something. It's not a very pleasant thing, but it was said, and it was apparently common knowledge back in those days, that the law enforcement community thought the survivor advocates' goal was to take straight women and turn them into lesbians. And the feeling from the survivor advocate community was law enforcement doesn't care about domestic violence. They're just a bunch of gun-toting yahoos. And so they literally would not be in the same room together. They didn't even want to be in the same building together oftentimes. But through the work, the diligent, dedicated, tireless work of advocates in our community, somehow, I wasn't part of that, but somehow they overcame that. And they got the law enforcement community and the survivor advocate community to come together and develop a relationship. And to go from that to where, and I'll share in a couple of slides some of the mission that came with that. The mission was designed for the community under our funded project from the Judicial Oversight Demonstration Initiative. Washtenaw County community was one of 3 federal selected, and the other 2 being Massachusetts and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And actually, we worked closely with Vera, and back then it was the Center for Court Innovation, now the Center for Court Justice, to help us formulate the mission statement that I'll be sharing with you. But we've came a long way, and it's possible to overcome that much adversity and get to the point where you can start having coordination, because the coordination is the hard part. The community response, that's always going on to whatever degree it's going on. we're falling short, we're doing a good job, and everything in between. But to coordinate it, and earlier people were using the term accountable. So coordinated and accountable. In order to do that, we have to understand who we're accountable to. And coordination and accountability is coordinated, we're accountable to the survivors. And that's one of the things that's unique about this. And if you think about coordinated community response, using a loose interpretation of evidence-based practice where you are essentially, you have something and you want somebody to give you their reaction to it. Could be a recipe, could be a coordinated community response. You say, how do you like this? And they say, I think it needs a little more salt, it needs a little more citrus, it needs a little more spice. And you come back and you make some changes and you go back. And that is a quick way of talking about the coordinated community response. The coordinated community response, and I'll keep going through the slides here, hopefully. If you could advance my slides out, let's see. Thank you. Oop, we did a little too many. We can go back one. In many communities, these are just, there's no connection. They're siloed, and we talk about being siloed. There exists survivor service organizations, the judiciary, prosecution, law enforcement. Those are some of the standard ones that we see. But the coordination and the integration, to have it go from, and as Jeremy pointed out, in that continuum from 911 all the way through the process, almost like an assembly line. And we want to understand at each point here, what was the effect on who we are accountable to, and getting that constant feedback through focus groups, through policy review, through assessment, coming back and fine tuning it, almost going back to that recipe metaphor, fine tuning it so it fits what our customer wants. So oftentimes you'll see these four as the central part of a coordinated community response. Rebecca showed you a slide with, I don't know, 35 different things that could be there. One of the things that sprung up in our community was the local hospitals creating a task force to develop practices and policies, in particular for universal screening at all points within the hospital. So that sprung up. That's not one of those silos, that's separate. Another effort came with the faith community. So all kinds of elements can be a part of this, but it's not so much coming to the table. Coming to the table is the last thing on that continuum. It's a lot of meetings that happen in between there, one-on-ones, sitting down with somebody, talking with them. As Greta said before, you can actually pick up the phone and talk to people. We've gotten so dependent on emails and nobody responds to my emails. I don't know what that means, and they must not like me or care about domestic violence or whatever it is. Before we had email, we called people, or if we didn't call them, we just went over to their office and knocked on the door and said, hey, can you spare a little bit of time? But what's absent from this picture in particular, and my focus here, is the element of battering intervention programs. And that is sensitive. So one of the things that happens is you've got this group that's typically, and there's some drawbacks to only having this one meeting. So hopefully, if you do work in a community that has the one meeting, that's the start. Everything that goes on in between, if you meet on the first Wednesday of the month, those weeks after that until the next month, there's a lot of work that goes on here. And this can't be something that is tacked on to somebody's job and you're going to expect some significant outcomes. And I'll talk about New Mexico's experience with this in a couple of slides. But you'll see, we want to find out what's happening with the abusive partner intervention program, the APIPs or the BIPs. And in fact, in my community, that was what created the desire to bring in, is when the judges said, okay, we're going to hear these cases. And the prosecutors said, we're going to rely on police reports for a good police report, and the probation said, we're going to do good PSIs. Everyone said, we're going to do what you're asking us to do. And the sheriff cleared his throat and said, what are you going to do with these guys? They're not going to fit in my jail. And somebody piped up and said, let's have a program for them. That's what started what I would call or what others have called also the second wave of battering intervention programs, or APIPs. So we have to work together. We can't solve this alone. Survivor service organizations are incredible assets in the community, but we have to work together in a way to coordinate this, to plan this out, to create our desired outcomes. One of the things that APIPs or BIPs bring to the community is nobody spends as much time, other than the survivor, nobody spends as much time with the perpetrator of domestic violence as the APIP does. And that puts APIPs, BIPs in a very important position to relay this information back to the system, whether it's about individuals or collectives or experiences, to help shine that light on a better understanding of what is going on with the person who is the perpetrator of harm. So here is that mission statement that I told you about from the Judicial Oversight Demonstration Initiative. My friend and colleague, retired Judge Libby Hines, says that essentially Vera and CCI locked us in a room for 2 days that had poor cell reception and wouldn't let us out until we cussed and discussed our mission. And so what you see here is the result of that woodshedding experience. I can still remember the building. I remember everyone complaining that their cell phones didn't work, but we came up with this and it's not anything fantastic. This is just good, solid CCR work. In New Mexico, and I'm doing my best to keep up with the time, Rebecca. In New Mexico, I started working with the coalition in 2000. And one of the goals was to grow the coordinated community response efforts there. So many things happened to do that. A couple of facts about New Mexico you see here, and I saw other people putting in information into the chat, and I think we can put documents in the chat. Can we, Rebecca? There's a couple documents that I'll put in there, just 2019, 2020, I think it is, and then the 25th anniversary of homicide data for the United States. So in the 2019 homicide data, New Mexico had the second highest homicide rate in the country, with a horrible conviction rate. Some communities as low as 1% for a statewide average of 11% of a conviction rate. We knew that what we had to do was to develop CCR efforts. And so, and one of the questions, and I think this is a fair question for you to ask in your communities, whether it's using that language or something similar, what message does it send to your community's survivors of domestic violence if you have a very low conviction rate? And what message does it send to the perpetrators in your community if you have a very low conviction rate? That speaks volumes. I said 2020, it's 21 that I started in New Mexico in this role. And we were incredibly fortunate to receive funding from the state legislature through the Children and Youth Families Department to fund CCR efforts in New Mexico, the first ever in the country to receive recurring funding to promote survivor safety. And what that funding allowed us to do was to create a process where communities could apply to be a focus site. We had enough money to fund 3 focus sites and 1 additional coordinator, community organizer for the entire state. And some of this actually has changed and updated. So I know I've got some of my colleagues on this call, but the Office on Violence Against Women had to approve these slides, and that was before these changes were made. Sorry, you guys, there are some tweaks here. I can mention what they are. So we hired, once those sites were selected, they applied, they went through a review process where the applications were reviewed by the Domestic Violence Division within Children, Youth, and Families Department. And Scott Miller was also on that team, as well as a state prosecutor. So 3 sites were created, and we moved to bring in 3 community organizers for each of those sites. You see here the team leader, Melissa Silver, who is now the director of this effort and some other things, and Mika Reagan here, who is now the team leader. So this has grown already. Mika works with 12 communities in New Mexico doing coaching and coordinated efforts around their CCR work. And then the 3 communities within New Mexico, Taos, Doñana County, and McKinley County, are all staffed by these 3 community representatives, organizers. And I'm sorry, I have to speed along here. And then the other 12 sites that Mika continues to coach and help coordinate, they're listed there. So it gives you an idea of what's possible. But what I want to stress here is how important it is to have that kind of funding. I've been a part of so many times where somebody's got a full-time job, and now we just say, okay, Greta, in addition to being the director, we're going to have you do this thing here. And it's really difficult to add that to somebody's full-time job. Having that funding creates the opportunity for concentrated efforts. And I want to stress this again, and I should probably just stop after that slide. This is back to what I mentioned about that evidence-based practice, and I'm using that term loosely. I'm not an evidence-based practice expert, but to have a focus group which can then lead to developing policies, practices, and procedures, then implemented, and then you come back to the focus group and you say, how's it doing? How's that soup taste? If we're doing a restaurant, we want to find the recipe that makes everyone the happiest. So what's your experience with last time we met? There was an issue with 911 putting you on hold for an hour. How's that How's that going? Have you had a chance to call 911? Are they putting you on hold? No. It was like got on with the person in 10 seconds. And then that just continual quality improvement through the coordinated community response. I'm going to put into the chat, if you're interested, a national peer CCR monthly call. You're welcome to join that. There's a link there. I'll also be dropping into those documents about the homicides, and happy to answer any questions once we get to that point. Rebecca, back to you.
Great, thanks so much. Let's see, there we go. We're moving along here. So we wanted to end this with just a few quotes. We see some things in the chat that are asking some more specifics. And I think I see Greta and Jeremy are answering them there. And we can certainly get back to you about those things as well. But the CCR is really almost broader in its mission. It's looking at all the various impacts of IPV, whereas often those specific collaborations are looking at one particular aspect of it. And we've got Gretta here. If you have more information or want more information about fatality review teams, for example, Gretta and Ujima are the OVW training and technical assistance provider on that. David and Jeremy certainly share their contact information with you, and they really have a lot of the practical application of what a CCR can look like. But let's just close it up here, and I'll invite Jeremy to talk about any closing statements here with this beautiful slide.
This some of y'all are familiar, see the medicine wheel, the 4 direction, and those colors representing north, south, east, and west, the cardinal directions. And it's one of the tools that we use. It's something pretty familiar across the woodland and the plains states. And we think about where that vision is. And so from the moment a child is born, we're always preparing them to be an elder. So that person coming in, we're always thinking, what are they going to be at the end? So it's not of just managing those babies into when they could talk, crawl, walk, go to school and all that stuff. We're thinking about how are we conditioning this person so when they're ready. And one of those examples is we use a cradle board, pretty common. That cradle board and that swaddling is to help develop the other senses, observation, hearing, and to self-regulate the physical. And because that's preparing when you're an adult, at some point in time, you're going to be uncomfortable and need to know how to self-regulate your energy and your emotion and uncomfortability and use a little bit of your cognitive skills, right? So that starts way young to prepare for an adult. And so we think of that, we're always thinking ahead. Time, everything is always the next season. So if you look at those colors as spring, summer, winter, fall, or fall, then winter, if you got the snow for the white, we're always thinking a season ahead. So that's really nice to do that in connection to how are we preparing people in the future. So not only do we do that with the community, but we also do that with men when we get into there, is how do we help men change to become adults? We often say to men, we look at their behaviors and say, when you slap, hit, yell, scream, what kind of behavior is that? What age appropriate behavior would that be? And people will say like toddlers, preschoolers, and all that, right? And so that's why you hear people say to men who batter, you are acting immature. Right? You're acting like an infant. That's acceptable behavior for people who are frustrated, who can't communicate, who don't understand. So we think about that in a compassionate way when we do our work as well. When someone's in an infant stage, we got to guide and nurture them along the way. And now we're not coddling the men in groups, but we want to understand that they are in a place where they did not get this teaching or don't have the capacity just yet. So we want to nurture them along. You want to get them ready for that adolescent phase where they could try and implement them skills on their own, just like a teenager. They do the try and failure to get them to that healthy adult phase where they're competent in doing what they're doing. And hopefully at some point in their life, they become that elder and then teach it on to the next generation. So we do that as well as with men, as when we work with the people we work with. We don't insult people for not knowing what we know. We like to put down cops and prosecutors for them not knowing they don't take DV seriously. They're just all about their own professional career, and we put them down, we insult them. But we wouldn't insult a baby for not knowing how to walk. We don't insult babies saying, oh, that stupid baby, look at them just drooling all over themselves. We don't do that. We nurture and support those people and help bring them along with us. And that's the way we can do that, apply into this work. How do we bring people along, provide them education, and create opportunities for them to grow and develop?
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think it's important too to have the coordinated community response to support those changes through time. Thanks for dropping this in the chat, David, that it's a verb, and you talked about a lot of the activities and action and the things needed for it. And we can end here with this. Gretta, any last comments?
Sure. Just also, I think one of the things that we tend to do is we overthink. Your coordinated community response is just everyone coming together to solve an issue that affects everybody. And one of my favorite quotes from Loretta Ross, this team already knows, is you can't do oppression work without working with the oppressor. And so there are many, and as we said in the early panel, we all have experienced violence and we all cause violence. And how can we bring our professional and our personal selves to the table to end, excuse me, gender-based violence? It's all about responsibility, and it's possible. That's the thing. I guess I'm eternally hopeful that it's possible if we come with the right hearts and minds at the table.
Awesome. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to the faculty for all of your amazing information and practical wisdom, and for ending us on a hopeful note.